In late 1891, rumors were swirling that John Foster might become the next Secretary of State. And that wouldn't quite happen just yet. But due to poor health and family issues, current Secretary of State James Blaine would retire in June of 1892, and John W. Foster would then become Secretary of State. And then he would become involved in a scandal that foreshadows multiple events to come in the following decades for the U.S. Marines and Smedley Butler, and I guess you could say would also evolve into a family specialty. And that's the overthrow or removal of the rightful rulers of a country to install leaders who are Wall Street approved. And in this case, we're going to look at what happened to the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893. On September 14, 1892, the U.S. Minister to the Kingdom of Hawaii, John Stevens, wrote to U.S. Secretary of State John Foster, telling him about the deadlock between the Queen and the legislature in Hawaii. To give you some backstory, Queen Liliuokalani was only on the throne for about a year and a half up to this point. Foreign nationals, the rich, and the sugar interests were already in control. And that's thanks to the Constitution of the Hawaiian Islands signed by His Majesty King Kalakaua in 1887. This stripped away most of the power of the monarchy and reduced King Kalakaua to a mere figurehead, and more aptly a puppet for the rich. And it also stripped away a lot of the rights of the native Hawaiian population as well. And it also earned the nickname the Bayonet Constitution, as King Kalakaua was forced to sign it by the rich who had the backing of the military. King Kalakaua would die not long after on January 20th, 1891, and his sister Liliuokalani would become queen. And she vowed to make changes, and did, which of course the rich didn't like very much. And here we are. In that same September 1892 letter to John Foster, John Stevens also writes that the USS Boston is in the harbor and Captain Wiltse will cooperate. Now we fast forward a few months to January of 1893, and because at this time it takes 10 days for news to travel to the mainland, we find out that on January 17th there was a revolution in Hawaii. The Queen was dethroned and a provisional government was established, and this was done by what was called a Committee of Safety. Secretary of State Foster received this morning advices from the Hawaiian Islands to the effect that the monarchy has been overthrown and a provisional government established in the interests of the whole people of the islands. And that's not true in the slightest, as the provisional government was set up for the interests of the rich. It was the Committee of Safety who appointed the provisional government, with several members of the Committee of Safety as part of it. And of the 13 members of the rich and elite who made up the Committee of Safety, only 4 of them were Hawaiian nationals, with the other 9 being foreign nationals, and 5 of them were American citizens, of course. These guys were the rich elites behind the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani, but they couldn't do it alone, and they certainly had help. The day after the overthrow, on January 18, 1893, John Stevens would send a telegram to John Foster via San Francisco, which would arrive on January 28th, and then be relayed across to Washington the same day. And he tells Foster that things in Hawaii are moving rapidly, and that the overthrow was done without the loss of life, and then goes on about the new government a bit. On the same day, January 18th, Stevens sent Foster another lengthy telegram as well, but for some reason doesn't get received until February 3rd. And in it, he sends a copy of the orders that he sent to Captain Wiltse of the USS Boston on January 16th, which is the day before the overthrow. And in it we can see he wrote to Captain Wiltse, "I request you to land Marines and sailors from the ship under your command for the protection of the United States Legation and United States Consulate, and to secure the safety of American life and property." After receiving the first message, John Foster writes back to Stevens on January 28th, telling him you will continue to recognize the new government under such conditions, and you will keep in constant communication with the commander of the United States Naval Force at Honolulu, with a view to acting if need be for the protection of the interests and property of American citizens, and aiding in the preservation of good order under the changed condition reported. So in other words, he's telling him to support the new provisional government. 2 weeks later, on February 15, 1893, U.S. President Benjamin Harrison would send a message to the United States Senate, in which he states, "I transmit herewith, with a view to its ratification, a treaty of annexation concluded on the 14th day of February, 1893, between Honorable John W. Foster, Secretary of State, who was duly empowered to act in that behalf on the part of the United States, and Lauren A. Thurston, W. R. Castle, W. C. Wilder, C. L. Carter, and Joseph Marsden, the commissioners on the part of the Provisional Government of the Hawaiian Islands." And 4 of those guys also happen to be on the Committee of Safety, with 3 of them also being part of the Provisional Government. President Harrison would also state, "The overthrow of the monarchy was not in any way promoted by this government," meaning the United States. But that's not true, as we'll see. Following President Harrison's message to the Senate, Secretary of State John W. Foster would also send a message. And in it he would state, "At the time the Provisional Government took possession of the government buildings, no troops or officers of the United States were present or took any part whatever in the proceedings." And again, as we'll see, that's not true. So with the overthrow of Hawaii's Queen Liliuokalani complete, President Harrison and Secretary of State Foster are trying to get the annexation deal that they reached with the Provisional Government ratified by the U.S. Senate. But look at the date, February 15, 1893. In less than 3 weeks' time, President Grover Cleveland is going to be inaugurated for his second presidency. And he was well versed in what was going on in Hawaii for the years leading up to the overthrow, as he was also president from 1885 to 1889. And we can see here, within a week after his inauguration, he sent to the Senate a curt message of 5 lines. Quote, "For the purpose of re-examination, I withdraw the treaty of annexation between the United States and the Provisional Government of the Hawaiian Islands, now pending in the Senate, which was signed on February 14, 1893, and transmitted to the Senate on the 15th of the same month, and I therefore request that said treaty be returned to me. Grover Cleveland." End quote. He appointed longtime Congressman James Blount to lead an investigation. And on December 18, 1893, President Grover Cleveland would deliver his own president's message relating to the Hawaiian Islands. And he makes quite a few scathing statements, such as, "On the 16th day of January, 1893, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a detachment of Marines from the United States steamer Boston with 2 pieces of artillery landed at Honolulu. The men, upwards of 160 in all, were supplied with double cartridge belts filled with ammunition, and with haversacks and canteens, and were accompanied by a hospital corps with stretchers and medical supplies. This military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was of itself an act of war." President Grover Cleveland would also state, "By an act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States, and without authority of Congress, the government of a feeble but friendly and confiding people has been overthrown." And President Grover Cleveland goes on to say, in Foster's communication of February 15th to the President, and he highlights the letter that we looked at earlier, where Foster stated that no troops or officers of the United States were present or took any part whatever in the proceedings, and so on. And President Cleveland says, "These statements are utterly at variance with the evidence." So President Grover Cleveland totally shot down the annexation plans of all these guys and called it an act of war. And to get a good idea of exactly what happened, we'll look at the statements of Charles Wilson, who, as Marshal of the Kingdom of Hawaii at the time, was in the best position to see what was going on both sides. And he says that on Sunday the 15th of January, he received information that there was a meeting being held at Lauren Thurston's house, and that the Committee of Safety were present. And the Committee of Safety was only formed the day before by Lauren A. Thurston, who's actually the one behind everything going on with the overthrow. And the object of the meeting was to overthrow the Queen by force. At this meeting, Thurston stated that Minister Stevens had promised to support them if they proclaimed a provisional government with troops from the USS Boston, and that their cause could not be a success without those troops and Minister Stevens' assistance. Charles Wilson says he proposed to put out warrants for the ringleaders of the overthrow, but the Attorney General objected, citing a few reasons. And ultimately, Peterson also said that the arrest of these parties would precipitate a conflict with the United States troops, which by this point was probably true. And Charles Wilson says that he pointed out that they had more than enough men and equipment to fend off any of the forces the USS Boston could land. And after receiving some more information, he again proposed that the ringleaders should be arrested. And again the Attorney General and the Queen's lawyer objected, saying it would precipitate a conflict with the U.S. troops, as Minister Stevens had already declared himself. Charles Wilson then says, "At about 4 p.m. I saw posters being put up, which the conspirators had drawn up and had printed that day, calling for a mass meeting on Monday afternoon and signed, Committee of Safety." The following Monday, the 16th, I received information that the Committee of Safety were to meet at Thurston's office. At 10 a.m., a committee from the conspirators had a meeting with the Cabinet in the Foreign Office. The meeting seemed to have been safety valves for letting loose whatever excess of feeling there may have been in the popular mind, for by 4 p.m., it seemed as if the dissatisfaction was all over, as there was scarcely anyone to be seen on the streets. It was like a calm after the storm. About 4:30 p.m., I got information that the Boston's men were ordered to land. About 4:40 p.m., the signal was given that the boats were being got ready on board the Boston, and that the artillery and the Gatling guns were being put onto the boats. Also, the men were armed with small arms. At a little before 5 o'clock, they were landed at the regular landing near Brewer and Company's in Charleston's Wharf. A little after 5 p.m., the American forces marched from the boat landing along Queen Street and turned up Fort Street and halted at the corner of Merchant and Fort Streets, 2 doors off of which is the United States Consulate. A company of bluejackets were ordered to the United States Legation, and the remaining companies were marched up Merchant Street into Palace Square, thence along King Street between the Palace and the Government buildings, and were halted in front of Mr. Hopper's residence on the south corner of the Palace enclosure, in full view of Her Majesty the Queen, about 200 yards away from the Palace and the Government buildings. This wrongful recognition by our minister placed the government of the Queen in a position of most perilous perplexity, and the minister he is referring to there is John Stevens. She knew that she could not withstand the power of the United States, but she believed that she might safely trust to its justice. She surrendered to the superior force of the United States, whose minister had caused the United States troops to be landed at Honolulu, and declared that he would support the provisional government. And when he says the superior force of the United States, he means the United States as a whole, not just the troops from the USS Boston. And that's how the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown in a bloodless coup. And although President Grover Cleveland wanted to see Queen Liliuokalani reinstated, he knew he couldn't do so without force. But considering the overthrow was done without the loss of life, force wasn't an option for him. And the provisional government would rule for a little over a year, until the Republic of Hawaii was created. But then in 1898, with the start of the Spanish-American War, which entailed the Philippines as well, President William McKinley would annex Hawaii. And as we saw in Part 2, Chapter 2 of this series, the 1898 Spanish-American War is when Smedley Butler begins his career. At the first session of the 103rd Congress of the United States on January 5, 1993, the United States officially acknowledged the 100th anniversary of the January 17, 1893 overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and offered an apology to Native Hawaiians. And in the resolution we see, whereas on January 14, 1893, John L. Stevens, hereafter referred to in this resolution as the United States Minister, conspired with a small group of non-Hawaiian residents of the Kingdom of Hawaii, including citizens of the United States, to overthrow the indigenous and lawful government of Hawaii. The United States Minister and the naval representatives of the United States caused armed naval forces of the United States to invade the sovereign Hawaiian nation on January 16, 1893, and to position themselves near the Hawaiian government buildings and the Iolani Palace to intimidate Queen Liliuokalani and her government. Whereas on the afternoon of January 17, 1893, a Committee of Safety deposed the Hawaiian monarchy and proclaimed the establishment of a provisional government. Whereas the United States Minister thereupon extended diplomatic recognition to the provisional government. And they're talking about John Stevens there. But remember, it was only 11 days after that, on January 28, 1893, that Secretary of State John Foster would tell John Stevens in a telegram, "You will continue to recognize the new government under such conditions." But interestingly enough, in this 1993 resolution, you'll not find Secretary of State John W. Foster's name anywhere, nor President Benjamin Harrison's name. They lay all the blame at Minister John Stevens and the Committee of Safety members, who are indeed mostly responsible for everything. But as we've seen immediately after the fact, they did have the support of the Secretary of State John Foster and President Benjamin Harrison as well. The resolution does mention President Grover Cleveland, though, and what he did. Whereas in a message to Congress on December 18, 1893, President Grover Cleveland reported fully and accurately on the illegal acts of the conspirators, described such acts as an act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States and without authority of Congress. After U.S. President Benjamin Harrison and Secretary of State John W. Foster made their false statements to the U.S. Senate on February 15, 1893, in their attempted illegal annexation of Hawaii. We see in the news exactly 1 week later, on February 22, 1893, that Secretary of State John W. Foster is going to retire from President Harrison's cabinet the following day. And what he's going to do is assume the active directorship and management of the case of the United States in connection with the sealing industries of the Bering Sea, also known as the Bering Sea Arbitration or the Fur Seal Arbitration. And he's due to set sail for Southampton, England on the Saturday and then eventually get to Paris. His days were very numbered as Secretary of State, as President Grover Cleveland's administration was coming in on March the 4th. But there's a reason he chose this particular assignment. And we have to go back 2 years to January of 1890. And that's when John W. Foster's daughter, Eleanor Foster, would get married to Robert Lansing. And then when we have a look in the American Journal of International Law, 1914, they give us a brief description of Robert Lansing's career, and we can see in 1892 he was appointed Associate Counsel for the United States in the Fur Seal Arbitration. So he's already out there in Paris, and his father-in-law, John W. Foster, is now on his way. And remember, he's going to assume the overall directorship and management of the United States' case, and start grooming his son-in-law for eventual positions in the State Department. So that's a look at John Watson Foster, grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Ella Macy Dulles. And we had a small glimpse of their uncle, Robert Lansing. And again, you can see a little bit more of him in Part 2, Chapter 2 of this series. But now let's go have a look at the extraordinary lives of the Dulles brothers. And here's a rare photo of all 3 generations of Foster, Lansing, and Dulles in a family photo. So anyways, that's how the United States stole and annexed the Kingdom of Hawaii. And that's quite the family line, isn't it? And it's fitting that Grandpa was involved in the takeover of Hawaii. And it's rather fitting that the Dulles brothers are his grandsons, and the nephews of another Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who they called Uncle Bert, who would keep the tradition going by being involved in interventions in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Russia, among other places. Lansing was also a total war hawk, trying to push for the United States to enter World War I after the sinking, and lies, about the Lusitania, in 1915. And then there's the third-generation brothers Allen and Foster Dulles. And whether as lawyers acting for the U.S. government and State Department, or Sullivan and Cromwell, or the United Fruit Company, or on their own, they spent decades being involved in far too many nefarious things to list here. And something most people don't know is that the brothers, along with their Secretary of State uncle, Robert Lansing, were also involved in the Paris Peace Conference, which were the negotiations of Germany's surrender after World War I and the reparations they'd be required to repay for the war. And most historians agree that it was too harsh, and was instrumental in raising tensions and opposition among the German people, which would eventually pave the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party. Anyways, to be fair to history and the truth, older brother Foster Dulles also disagreed with the harshness of the treaties that were signed, and also felt that they were part of the contributing causes to World War II. But at the same time, through the Dawes Plan, or by being directors and board members, the brothers would help finance companies like IG Farben, Krupp AG, the Consolidated Celestian Steel Company, the J. Schroeder Banking Corporation, and so many more. And those companies, banks, and industries were instrumental in bringing Adolf Hitler into power. And of course, more recently, and more famously, Allen Dulles was chosen to be part of the Warren Commission that was supposed to investigate the murder of President John F. Kennedy, which is ironic as a large amount of the JFK assassination research community believe Allen Dulles was involved in the assassination. And considering the overall history of Allen Dulles and his brother, uncle, and grandfather, as well as the overall history of the JFK assassination and the files, I guess it totally makes sense that they would put Allen Dulles on the Warren Commission. Something else that most people don't know about Allen Dulles is that he was also the best of friends with a member of another generational family with a history of nefarious actions. And that would be Prescott Bush, son of Samuel Bush, who began working with the Rockefellers and Harrimans in 1901 and established the Bush family name among the Wall Street Kings. And Prescott Bush, being the best of friends with Allen Dulles, totally made sense, as like Allen Dulles, and through entities like Brown Brothers Harriman and the Union Banking Corporation, Prescott Bush was also financing and helping the Nazi war machine, right into October of 1942. Watch my video on Prescott Bush to see the full story on that. And Prescott Bush would go on to be a powerful senator of Connecticut for 10 years, and was also good friends and regular golf partners with President Eisenhower. And he was of course the father and grandfather of the two George Bush U.S. presidents. So, from the takeover of Hawaii in 1893 to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that's 110 years of interventions, coups, assassinations, invasions, creating dictators, and more. And decade by decade, in the background of all of that, you'll find these two family lines playing a role.